Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to our second session in our Panic Together weekend, our first weekend of two. My name is Bryony Bond, and I'm the director of the Tetley. I'm a white woman in her 40s wearing glasses and with a green pullover on. And in the background is an embroidered picture of the art house, so you know where I am. This afternoon, I'm very pleased. Our talk is with Helen Nisbet, who I'll introduce shortly, but just some practical things. So if you want to use closed captions, they've been enabled and you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. We are filming the session today and it will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after the session. Panic, just for people that might not know, is promoting an artist network in the crisis. And so it was a network that we set up during the pandemic. And we've been working over the last year to support artists with bursaries, with a program of mentoring, and with events like these. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Helen Nisbet. And Helen is artistic director for the National Contemporary Art Festival Art Night. She previously held positions at organisations including Qubit, the Arts Council Collection, the Contemporary Art Society, the Lighthouse, and has contributed to programmes at Creative Time New York, the Venice Biennale, and London-based galleries Hollybush Gardens and the Sunday Pater. And today, Helen is going to be talking about what does it mean to have an independent curatorial practice. So I'm going to hand over to Helen, and just a reminder that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll be directing those to Helen at the end of the session. So thank you very much, and over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Bryony. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to be with you all. A little introduction. So I'm Helen Nisbet. I'm a white woman approaching her 40s. Who is in a white room, two pictures on the wall behind me, one by artist Christine Soon Kim, the other one by a Shetland-based artist, Amy Gear, and I have a bookshelf on my right-hand side as well. So today, let me just see if I can share my screen with you. So hopefully that's good, and it says hi. So really what I thought we would begin by doing is just to have a little kind of run through my own journey into curating, which is very much as an example, but very much not as a model, because I think hopefully what I'm going to talk about mostly today is how there's no one route into curating. And that it's often wibbly wobbly, and that is okay, and that's kind of important, and that your own path into curating and the way that you curate is really essential. And I think the reason I'm going to talk through my own kind of route into curating, I guess, is because I've often found it can feel a little bit impossible when you're thinking, like, how do people do this? And so for me, I always find it useful to know how other people have kind of gotten into the world and how they did it. It's not letting me. Okay, here we go. So I think something that's really important about me is that I'm from the Shetland Islands in Scotland, and I have lived and worked in London for quite a few years. But there's always a very big part of me that is rooted in Shetland and really thinking about Shetland a lot. And so I'm going to come back to this kind of dichotomy between the kind of London curatorial self and the person who's from an island. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I studied history of art at the University of Glasgow. It was a 4-year degree, and it was really an important time for me, because in Scotland, I don't know, I think it's different in England, but in Scotland you begin when you go to like a university, you begin by choosing 3 subjects and you only major in your 3rd and 4th years. So for someone like me who is really not from an arts background, my family were certainly not in any way related to the contemporary art world or even to the world of academia. I really struggled to know what the subject would be that I would study. So I began doing politics and just took history of art as a kind of side subject, and it became the thing that I majored in. And that kind of history of art through the lens of politics has always been very important to how I work. And so when I graduated, my first kind of route into the art world was through working with artists in their studios. So on the left is an image of Andy Goldsworthy. So I worked with him making an archive of his ephemeral works from the 1980s, and also supporting him in the production of new work in the borders of Scotland. It was a pretty dreamy job, actually. And then I moved to London, and I was Ryan Gander's first ever studio assistant, which was a really like a very useful introduction into what a contemporary artist actually does in their studio, and also what it looks like when they're sort of developing and preparing for exhibition. So like a really useful kind of early education. But I actually wanted to say alongside that, so while I was at university and when I first graduated, I also worked in a care home in Shetland. So the image on the left is just a generic nursing home image, and the image on the right is the actual glamorous care home that I worked in. And I think I always try to talk about this as much as possible, because working in that care home was not only essential for me financially, but I think it's actually been as inspirational and important to my career trajectory as anything else I've done, in terms of what it really means to work together with people and to care for people. And I think, you know, again, I think we'll probably come back to that a little bit later. But back to the more kind of practical curatorial stuff. And now I'm just going to kind of go back and forth a little bit. So this is non-linear, but just to show the breadth, because I have not, you know, just done one type of art production, art curating, art commissioning in my career. I've had quite a kind of varied path. And so, as Bryony mentioned, I worked at the Contemporary Art Society for quite a long time. And the Contemporary Art Society exists to support museums and galleries across the country. But my work was bringing in money for the organisation through public art commissioning. So I worked with universities, local authorities, hospitals to commission artists to make public artworks. And so these are images from a project I did with Cambridge University, who were expanding the university into a part of Cambridge that had been farmland. And so this was kind of going on over 20 years. And so they wanted to set up an artist residency program to get artists to kind of support this transitional period. And so on the left is an image by of work by Nina Pope and Karen Guthrie, where they mapped out a master plan of what this new community was going to look like with the mud from the farm. And on the right is an image of one of the farm, an old kind of barn that we turned into an artist studio, and it was actually taken over for a year by Cambridge-based artist studio Aid and Abet. And then I also worked for a short period of time in New York with the organisation Creative Time. This was very much me trying to kind of get more of a feel for what it means to work in public art that is somehow socially focused and socially engaged, and that there's kind of interest in what happens when you bring contemporary art to communities. And so on the top, there's a work by Otabenga Jones and Associates, and on the bottom is a work by Zenobia Bailey. I also have done a lot of work commissioning artists to make new work. So I worked with the Arts Council collection on a project to celebrate their 70th anniversary. And so in order to celebrate the 70th anniversary, we worked with 8 different artists to make brand new artworks that would tour. So they would go to different museums and galleries around the country, and then they would go back into the collection to be enjoyed by the nation forevermore, or however long they last. And so on the left-hand side is a work by Heather Phillipson, and on the right is by Keith Piper. The work by Heather Phillipson was initially shown at the Plymouth Art Centre, and the work by Keith Piper was a co-commission with Innova in London, and it was presented at the Blue Coat in Liverpool. And actually, that was a really interesting project because the Heather's work was a real opportunity for her to kind of develop her practice. And Keith's work, you know, she was kind of quite an established artist, but at a kind of earlier point than some of the other artists. Keith is such an interesting artist because he'd had a lot of success in the 1980s and 90s, and then had really kind of gotten into teaching and had stopped making so much work, or at least publicly. And this to me felt like the moment where he kind of came back a little bit, and people, a kind of new generation of people, were reminded about how great he is and how important his work is in the kind of intersection of art and technology. I think it's always important to, like for me, not to just think about artists who are emerging, but to think about artists at all stages in their career, and artists at pivotal moments when the support you give them could really help them to get to the next level, or to kind of come back after a time of, you know, not making work or having children. So I think, you know, this conversation around when we work with artists is also really important, and we can come back to that later. I've also done quite a bit around architecture, which I think sits quite nicely with like public art commissioning. So quite a few years ago now, I organised a retrospective exhibition of the Scottish modernist architect Gillespie Kidd-and-Coya, who made some of the most incredible modernist buildings in Britain, including a place called St Peter's Seminary, which is in Cardross in Scotland, which is a bit of a masterpiece. And I also organised the Scottish Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, which sat outside the train station in Venice. It was designed by Gareth Hoskins Architects, and was very much just a place for people to go and gather and sit. But then underneath, in that kind of void area, there was space for talks and events. So it was a really incredible experience. And it was the first time I'd spent time in Venice at one of the biennales. So it's really useful kind of experience working on that. And then there's also the element of my work, which is, you know, more like straight up exhibition curating. And I'll talk about Qubit, which has been really, really important to me. I also recognise how lucky I am to have had this experience, because what Qubit do is they offer a fellowship to a curator to work for 18 months to develop a programme. And it's very much you run the programme, you fundraise. If things go well, that's great. If things don't go well, that's okay too. So it gives you space to experiment, to make mistakes, to try things out. And it really helped me to kind of hone, I guess, my curatorial voice, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. And so the first exhibition I did looked back on Leonard Carrington, who is an artist that I'd become interested in when I was studying history of art. And the whole time I studied history of art, even though it was in the, you know, early noughties, it could have been 30 years previous, we didn't ever talk about women. And so when we did a whole 6-month module on surrealism, we've barely touched on the women that were involved in that movement. And I got a real thing for Leonora Carrington at that time. And so even though Qubit is very much a contemporary space, I actually thought it would be a perfect chance to come back and think about her, and to present her as like a contemporary artist rather than as a surrealist, and also to consider her writing. And so writing became a really important thread throughout that whole programme. And I worked with quite a lot of writers in the process of making the exhibitions in that space. But the image on the right is an all-day reading group we did of her novel, The Hearing Trumpet, where people just sat together and took it in turns to read together. And it was a really, like a very special moment kind of for me, personally and professionally, I would say. And then alongside Qubit, there's smaller projects I've done in partnership with commercial galleries. And again, we can maybe talk about the difference between commercial and public galleries at some point. But I worked with some smaller, I guess more like, you know, bolder commercial galleries who were willing to kind of put on exhibitions that weren't about them selling work. So I did a series of weekend projects with Hollybush Gardens based around the films of Margaret Tate. And so this is the presentation of work I did by Jasleen Kaur. And then I also worked with the Sunday Painter Gallery. Both are in London. And this one was inspired by the film Shirley Valentine, and kind of spoke around like middle age and domesticity and women's experiences. And so that was late 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And so I kind of, when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking, right, well, what are the things that pull together, my experience and the work I've done? And I'm only able to do this retrospectively because at the time, it often felt like nothing made particular sense. But I think there's a real focus on non-traditional art spaces, commissioning new work, which I know you spoke about in the previous session, supporting artists at pivotal moments in their careers, intersectional feminism, and for me, the importance of thinking about class, but also accessibility, whether that's around class or also around disability and the many barriers to entry that people face. And I think maybe it's because of things like that that have led me to be more interested in working outside of traditional gallery spaces. So I say this to remind you that non-linear, sugary, feeling lost routes into curating are fine. The more varied, nuanced, or seemingly irrelevant the experience, the more interesting. When I look at CVs for people applying for jobs, I'm always bowled over when they have something unusual in there, whether it's a degree in astronomy or that they used to be nurse. I'm always interested in artists and curators who've kind of approach things slightly differently. I think it can, for example, Helen Nisbet, who's an artist who I think is incredible, who I've worked with quite a lot, spent quite a long time working as a social worker before she became an artist. And I think that has made a hugely positive impact on her work. And now I'll talk about Art Night, which is what I'm doing at the moment. So Art Night is, as Bryony described, a contemporary art festival. It began in 2016, and for the first 4 festivals, it was London-based, and it was very much the same format where over the course of one evening, there are a series of between sort of 10 and 12 major commissions by internationally significant contemporary artists, and they're making and presenting work in unexpected spaces. So, and often in partnership with a major institution. So the first Art Night took place in partnership with the ICA in London. So everything was kind of all along the Mall. So like a very spectacular, touristy experience of central London. The work on the left is by Linder. The work on the right is by Zhu Chan. The work by Linder is just outside the steps on the ICA leading down to Buckingham Palace. And the one on the right is Somerset House. So really kind of incredible spaces to be experiencing these artworks. The second Art Night took place in Whitechapel and was curated by Fatosh Uztek. And that was the first time a slightly more kind of permanent approach to commissioning happened. So the Doho So commission on the left was there for several months. And then the one on the right is Silent Disco by Melody Manshow. And then the third Art Night was with the Hayward Gallery and was curated by Ralph Rugoff, all along the South Bank of London. So Battersea Power Station, that's a work by Suzanne Treaster, and Cecile B. Evans made a kind of live artwork where she was actually making the work in front of the audience, and then the work that she made went on to travel to the tramway in Glasgow. And so the first Art Night I curated was in Walthamstow, and I think that was really key for me because it was no longer central London, it was East London and very much part of a community. And again, that's evidently where my interest kind of lies. And so rather than these kind of grand buildings that are not used for, or that they're traditionally used for arts, or they're not used for anything kind of municipal, we were using very civic spaces. So Walthamstow Library on the left, where Zaidi Cha made a kind of multimedia installation with sculpture and film and dance. And then also it was really important to me to make sure that people who spend a lot of time in the area didn't feel like that night wasn't for them. So spent a lot of time getting to know the people who are members of this social club, the Trades Hall, and most members were over 65, and a lot of them were way over 65. So on the night of Art Night, there was a woman who's going to have her 90th birthday. So I just said, if we put on like a really good birthday party for you with your favorite band and get you a great cake, can we open your doors up to Art Night audiences? And so honestly, like I think that's one of my favorite project of all time, even though it wasn't necessarily an artist commission, but it was just a way of making sure that people felt welcomed within their own community, and that we hadn't just kind of parachuted in uninvited and unexpected. Alongside the Walthamstow programme that year, we did a little bit of work in King's Cross, and this is a piece by Christine Soon Kim, who also made the work behind me. And it says, if sign language was considered equal, we'd already be friends. So Christine is deaf herself, and she made this project in partnership with Frank Barnes School for Deaf Children, really thinking about their experience of, I guess, life and the things that were important to them. So it was a series of 3 different works, kind of held together by this billboard, which ended up being there for a year. It's a really special piece. And then, of course, Art Night in 2020 was postponed because of this thing that you may have heard about called the global pandemic. Yeah, so, you know, it was a time of, you know, it was hellish for so many of us. But one good thing to come out of it was I was able to do something that I'd been hoping to do with Art Night since I started in the role, which was to turn it into a national organisation. So we postponed the 2020 programme and just tried to make sure that everybody was taking care of themselves as a priority. And we did a small digital programme like everyone else was doing, which was really useful for us. And then we did the festival in 2021, and it was a series of partnerships that took place across the whole country, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales, and lasted a month, I guess, as a pilot, not because we necessarily wanted to become a month-long festival, but just it felt like the right thing to do at the time. And so one of those projects was the billboard by the Guerrilla Girls that looked back to the 1980s work around, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? And asked about how things are now, you know, because that's still a very relevant question, and asked how things are in Britain. So inviting people, members of the public, to go to the local museum and count how many women artists were in their collections. And so image on the top left is Swansea, going clockwise, Eastbourne. Then below that is Glasgow, just outside the Barrowlands. And then, of course, the billboard that was in Leeds in partnership with the Tetley. And then we also did a project in the Isle of Skye with Atlas Arts, where Isabel Lewis created a series of walking tours over the course of one weekend. And she also made a really beautiful sound piece that was played in a town, like a village hall, in Skye, and also in Compton Verney, which is a beautiful big manor house in Warwickshire. And then Alberta Whittle, who's representing Scotland at the Venice Biennale this year, made a series of works. One of them was a performance in London. She made a work that we showed online, and she made a new video that we screened at Abergavenny train station in Wales throughout the course of the festival. So this, just to kind of go back to Art Night, so this kind of signals the way that I'm hoping to take the festival now in the future. So instead of being annual, we're going to be biannual. So we'll take place every 2 years, and we'll go back to that model of being in one place for one big night, but it won't be London. So we're kind of looking at different kind of towns and cities and villages across the country, and where Art Night might be placed in the next few years at the moment. So it's quite an exciting time. So another little kind of moment to pause, I guess. So, you know, when I was putting together this presentation, I was thinking, you know, of some of the most important things to me as a curator anyway. And I think it's absolutely about how you support, champion, nourish and enrich artists' work. It's also about how you can advocate for and action a better industry for everybody. And that's really important. And again, I think maybe that's something that we can talk about later if it's useful to you. And then also as an individual curator, so for me, I have worked within institutions, and I've also worked as a freelancer, as a kind of independent curator. And so even though now I'm artistic director of Art Night, I still feel like an independent curator. And I think that happened around the time I did Qubit, where I felt like actually my approach to working is more to do with the kind of wider ecology rather than my place within an institution. And so that kind of independent curatorial work is very much about recognizing who you are and not trying to emulate what other people do. So who you are, what you're interested in, and what your experience is paramount. So being curious about other people's work is really important, but don't let it define your work. And I think it's, it's a very difficult thing to not do, especially with social media, but not comparing yourself to other people is, I mean, nobody's cracked it completely, but I think it's an important thing to try to avoid. I often come back to this idea of the divided self when I'm thinking about myself. So R.D. Laing is a Scottish psychoanalyst who wrote this great book about the idea of an authentic private identity, the one that we actually, the people we actually feel we are, and then this more kind of public identity, the one that we present to the world. So he called that the sane one, the sane face we present to the world, which may or may not be false. And you can take this as far as you want to, but it's this idea of the divided self is really prevalent in Scottish literature as well. And I find it really interesting because I'm often feeling like two different people, because I'm working in London in an industry that is heavily middle class, if not, sometimes nudging at upper class. It's so far removed from the place I grew up in. And also when I go back to Shetland, it's very difficult for me to talk about my work. And so I feel like I've always got this kind of slight push and pull. And I think we all have this in some ways. But for me, that kind of Shetland, London, public, private self has always been something that's kind of amused and interested me. And at times it's been quite hard to kind of know what to do with it. Here's an image of my little village in Shetland. But actually, for various reasons, so I sit on a few boards of organisations in Shetland, but I've never actually really done much work there, which is interesting. And I'm sure I will at some point, but it's just never quite happened. But what I have done and what's been really useful and important for me personally is I'm also a writer. And so I've done writing about Shetland. So in Shetland dialect, talking about this kind of idea of a divided self, and also thinking about what it means to, how my version of Shetland and growing up there and being from generations and generations of people from this island compares to often kind of Orientalist ideas of what it means to be from a kind of remote island community. So this first book here is a book I did in collaboration with Maria Fusco, who was compiling a series of books around dialect and published by Bookworks. And then this other one, These Are the Stones We Have Instead of Trees, which I made as part of a project that the academic Marcus Jack was doing. So it's kind of focusing on Margaret Tate, who's an Orcadian filmmaker, but also talking about, this kind of experience of growing up in Shetland and the kind of otherness of how that's led me to feel. And then recently, in lockdown, I was able to spend quite a bit of time in Shetland. So I was organising the 2021 festival from Shetland, and it's something that I've dreamed of being able to do for years, but I never necessarily imagined that it could happen. So it was a real revelation, I guess, to find out that through this new remote way of working that it was possible. And so that's been really important for me. And I think I'm now at a point where I'm thinking about how I can maybe be in Shetland more. So maybe, after almost 20 years of being a curator, I think I'm finally ready to try and think about what it means to maybe be somebody who's actually doing work in Shetland as well. And so moving away from me to talk more broadly about how, what does, how do we become curators? How do we get into the field? How do we gain experience? How do we kind of pull together our kind of independent curatorial voices? And so just having a think about this, there's so many routes into being a curator or being an artist curator, or whatever it is, that's the kind of the way that you work. And you know, there's obviously this route of doing the MA in curatorial practice. So disclaimer, I never did one. For years, I felt kind of anxious about that, but actually I was just never able to afford to do it. And I kept thinking maybe at some point I would, and then it just was not necessary at a certain point. And so I think, you know, curatorial MAs are brilliant and really valuable and incredibly rich, but I'm also here to tell you that it's not the only way. I am really inspired by artist collectives and artist-led spaces. So this is an image of Ruang Grupa, who are a Jakarta-based artist collective. So Indonesian group of artists who are really inspired and really pioneering in the way that they work. And they are going to be curating the next Documenta. And I just think that's like, I just find that really exciting, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. And then of course there are internships, and I think kind of thankfully, I hope anyway, internships have kind of changed from what they used to be. They used to just be like literally unpaid, and you were treated fairly badly to do a lot of menial work for big institutions or smaller institutions. I've certainly had that experience myself. And I think the ethics around how internships are run are shifting. So please, like if people offer you an internship and it's unpaid, I would question that. But this is an image of a group of interns at MoMA in New York. And I think, you know, these big institutional internships can be a great way of trying to navigate that kind of like larger scale gallery museum institution. Because for me, again, for whatever reason, I felt like a lot of my friends understood the system better than I did, but I struggled to understand where I might sit within a museum institution. So, you know, education, pure exhibition making, interpretation, audience development, press, marketing. There's so many facets to galleries and museums. And I think actually like trying to figure out where you feel like you belong, and this can take a long time. Sometimes internships can be useful for that, but again, it's not the only way. And then I kind of wanted to also mention a small gallery that I've come across recently. So I've been spending a bit of time in Dundee recently in Scotland, and I've come across this great little gallery called Whoosh, who run out of a car park, and it's just run by recent graduates from the art school in Dundee. And they install work really quickly in a car park. The works are lit by the lights from cars, and it's very kind of DIY, and it's also just really brilliant. And so I just think, you know, that it's kind of just testament to the fact that there's not one way to get into this kind of thing. And it's just about, again, thinking like what's actually the best avenue for me and what works for me. And also like not being scared to try things out and to give things a go. So yeah, Whoosh, I just think are really amazing. I just want to give them a wee mention. And so I'll just finish on, I guess, like thinking about what you can do to figure out where your, you know, what your position is, what your interests are, what your own particular curatorial voice is. And these are things that I do and that I think are important. The list is longer, and you know, feel free to add your own things to this. But I think reading is really, like for me anyway, is really, really vital. And I think that came out really strongly when I was doing the program at Cuba. It was actually the world of writing and reading really sit in parallel to my curatorial work. And so by reading, I mean everything. I mean, without any hierarchy, without any bias, you know, whether it's art publications, and I think, again, it's important to keep abreast of those, but also fiction of your choice, non-fiction, like whatever it is you're interested in reading, I think is always going to support your curatorial practice. Similarly with watching, like, you know, whether it's documentaries, whether it's a movie subscription and you watch a lot of films, or whether it's like soap operas, again, I just think it just can all add such richness to curatorial work. You know, I mentioned that Shirley Valentine was a big inspiration for how I curated the show at the Sunday Painter. And of course, you know, seeing shows is vital, something that we've kind of all missed a lot in the past couple of years. But I think just seeing as much as you can is just really inspiring, and making time for that. I'm really personally guilty of not making space, you know, for things and being too busy, but actually just making sure I go and see shows. So whether that's in Leeds, across England, across the UK, or internationally, just as many shows as you can. And also kind of being wide open about the type of gallery that you're going to. So artist-led spaces, public galleries, commercial galleries, or more institutional galleries and museums. I think there's a place for all of them, and it's good to get a feel for the kind of work that they're all presenting and the ways that they do that. And that's also a really good way of trying to figure out where you might kind of belong in amongst all of these different worlds. You know, social media can suck, but it's also, I think, an incredibly powerful tool as a way of getting to know artists, not just in your own networks, but nationally, internationally. Similarly with galleries, you know, who are they presented, but also how are they talking about that work? Following curators, following writers. I find social media really useful, but not a replacement for the next thing, which is studio visits, which I've really missed lately, but I'm kind of getting back into it now. And that time with an artist is so precious and important. And I would say just a note on studio visits is, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are artists yourselves, but just being mindful of what you're doing when you're going into an artist's studio. So, you know, it's a very vulnerable time for an artist to be visited by a curator. And so I think being clear about what your hopes are for the visit before you come. You know, I've done studio visits with artists where we'll probably never work together, but it's really useful and interesting to get a sense of the practice. I've done studio visits with artists who then 5 years later, we work together because only then the right project comes along. And I've also done studio visits where it's directly led to an exhibition and it's kind of sorted within a couple of days. So I think it's just, obviously you don't always know, but I think it's just like trying to be as clear as possible about what you're hoping the studio visit will achieve. And then when you're in there, you know, actually talking about the work, because again, I think artists, you know, it's a very exposing experience to have a studio visit. And so just to make sure that you're also talking about the work with the artist and being supportive. And then also when, you know, when it's over, just making sure you thank them and that you let them know what the next steps will be, whether it's just that it was great to meet them and that you'll keep the, you know, I think just making sure that it doesn't just end there and that's it. Or if that is the end of the relationship, just making sure that it's clear that it might not lead to anything direct, but it was wonderful to meet them. I think sometimes the kind of ethics around studio visits is a little bit grey. And I think I know people who've been quite badly affected by that. And then this brings us to my final point, which is just about considering your ethics. So as a curator, regardless of whether you're working in an institution, you've got your own independent practice, whether you're an artist, whatever your kind of position is in the world, what are your ethics? How do you want to work with people and how do you want to support people? And I just think that's a really important thing to always consider and always have in your mind. And so this final image is just a kind of like a cheesy pondering image to keep that in our minds. And I don't know actually how we're doing time-wise.
You're doing brilliant, Helen.
Great.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for that really, really brilliant, inspirational talk. So thank you. We've got a couple of questions, so go straight into them. So first question is around how do you get these projects? Did you apply? Did you approach people, or did people come to you?
Yes. Okay, let me think about what did I talk about? So almost all of them I had to apply for. And like, please, can I tell you that I have a folder on my desktop with about 400 job applications. You know, like maybe I'm exaggerating, but really, you know, around 50 job applications for things I've applied for, maybe more actually, and have either not got interviews for or interviewed for and not got. So it can be brutal. So you're seeing jobs, you're applying for them, and you know, at the beginning of my career, and still this is an ongoing process, and it's really difficult, and it's very hard to maintain confidence, and it's very hard to maintain motivation when you're applying and applying and applying and you're not getting things. But please don't let that put you off. So almost all of these opportunities are things, or all these things I spoke about are things that I have applied for and, you know, been successful in getting. The creative time thing was, I'd been at the Contemporary Art Society for 5 years, and so it was a sabbatical supported by the Arts Council, because I really wanted to develop my work more into social practice, and also into like, I was specifically interested in that project because they were working within communities, and so it was more like a research project for me. So that was me, you know, Creative Time didn't pay me. I just kind of went there as an observer. And I'm trying to think about all the other roles. And then I guess the last two I spoke about, with Hollybush Gardens and the Sunday Painter, were me being approached to curate programs for people, which is a really like wonderful position to be in. And I'm sometimes can't really believe my own luck that, you know, I'm at a stage where people will ask me to do things like that, because you know, it's like there's such wonderful opportunities. But again, I think in amongst all that, there are always ways that you can make your own opportunities while you're waiting for something else to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is a bit of a kind of follow about that. I'm going to kind of roll two questions together here. One is about actually how you approach artists and pair artists and spaces up. And I think kind of part of that question was someone else's question, which is about how you make sure, I guess, a curator organization isn't just parachuting in, and how you make everyone feel welcome, which is a really great question, actually.
That's a brilliant question. It's literally like, that question is everything. But the first bit of that, so how do you choose? I actually don't really know the answer to that. I feel like it's kind of that last slide, you know, so it's like, and I think I was at a talk last night with Helen Nisbet, who I think she's on my mind. So she spoke a lot about the work she made when she was at Wising, and that work spoke about the importance of idleness. And idleness is, you know, in her interpretation, it's not laziness, it's just about giving your brain space. And so I think reading, watching, meditation, thinking, like these things that we do around curating are as important as the kind of curating itself, because I think there's often a bit of confusion about what curating actually is. You know, is it like, oh, that red looks nice with that blue? Hopefully not. So I think giving space and time for yourself to let things fall. And that's why, you know, when you meet an artist, and this is something I talk to artists a lot about, is like, they then go into like a little Rolodex in your mind of, I don't know, people don't use Rolodexes anymore, do they? But like, you know, there's just a filing cabinet in my brain anyway, where I store artists, and it's just about thinking like, this is the right moment, or this would be a really good opportunity for them, or I'm really excited about their work. And so you know, when I talk about pivotal moments, I think it's also really important to, yeah, think of, you know, especially if you've liked someone's work in the past and you haven't seen what they've been up to recently, is like check in with them, because quite often an artist hasn't had an opportunity, and so therefore they've not really been publicly seen to be making work. And I think it's really important to kind of prod that a bit, and not just go with the same people that we're seeing over and over and over again. So it's just about putting in the time and the care and the, you know, so it's the reading around artists, it's visiting people in their studios, and then it's just like, whether you want to like write it down, so you've got a list of people you'd love to work with, or whether it's more just something that you kind of ponder and it comes to you. It's like an ongoing long-term bit of work for me. And then the question around how to not just parachute into communities is everything to me. It's everything, it's everything, it's everything. And I think maybe at the beginning of my career, I didn't even know that I had the power to consider that. And I think like the Creative Time placement really helped me, because a lot of what I saw there wasn't great. I think there's a big, you know, it's a big New York based organization, and they tried really hard to not parachute in. They worked really closely with the local community center, But the community centre lost funding before the project happened. And so most of its staff weren't there anymore. And so inevitably, you know, there's just this element of like mainly white people in a Black community programming complicated contemporary art commissions. And I think I came back to London thinking this is what I do not want to do. And so when I spoke about, you know, me, especially thinking about Walthamstow Art Night as a good example, when I got that job, you know, the thing I was most interested in was the fact that it was Walthamstow and not central London, because I was keen to work within a community. And I always start any new kind of role like that by thinking, how would I feel if somebody arrived in Shetland and told me that they were going to do a contemporary art program in my village? And I think I'd be pretty furious. And, you know, even without the job I do at the moment, I think I'd be furious. And so I think it's just about getting to know people, and it's about spending time with people, finding out maybe what is not appropriate. And also when you're commissioning artists in that context, you know, if you're working with artists in a gallery, it's kind of, if you can do what you like because it's a gallery, and that is I mean, I don't actually mean that, because I think actually when you present work in galleries, you have to think about the public as well. But there is more expectation that people are going to be coming in and engaging with contemporary art. When you're doing that within people's communities, you have to be really sensitive, like really particularly sensitive. And so making sure that the artists you're working with share that sensitivity. And so for Art Night, it's thinking that not all, because I think it shouldn't have to be every single commission that engages somehow, but that the majority of works will be created site specifically, and that there will be a kind of longer term outreach program where you're either working with the artist or you're working with someone who's a specialist in working within communities to ensure that people are really involved. So the program in Walthamstow, we worked with a lot of schools. So Joe Nami did this brilliant project where he worked with people who like soup up cars. So a whole community of mainly men who soup up their cars, brought their cars along, and Joe DJ'd through the sound systems of their cars. I mean, they'd worked together on that for about 6 months before. And then he'd also worked with some young people from Leighton Sixth Form College who had made some tracks that were then played on the night. And those young people a lot of them had been negatively affected by knife crime in the area. And so Joe did a lot of close work with the head teacher there and with the music teacher there to make sure that he was really prepared to be working with those young people. So again, it's just really thinking about, you know, who are we working with? What are we doing? And also not sort of buggering off at the end of it and saying like, well, thanks very much for giving us your library, we're off now, but just thinking like, what do we leave behind? You know, what relationships are left behind, what's put in place. So, you know, I spoke about the trades hall that we did the event in, and we tried to leave them with you know, bits of money that they could do like very basic bits of DIY and fixing like the bar and fixing the jukebox and things that they just hadn't been able to do for quite a long time. That was like a fairly small thing for Art Night to be able to do, but it really supported them long term. So it's just thinking about these kind of caring things you can do, and also just always again just thinking about what your individual impact is and what the impact, you know, what the impact your work is having on people. And that's very much from the perspective of kind of public work.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to follow up with I think someone else has asked a question about actually working both as a practicing artist and a curator. I guess maybe more in terms of not possibly your personal experience, but just in terms of like, are there certain things to avoid, I think, if you're working as an artist and a curator?
I don't know. I mean, a little bit like what I said at various points in the presentation, I always just think people who bring myriad experience to, you know, the role of being a curator, that's brilliant. So I always think, you know, artist curators tend to be really good and very thoughtful and very clever about the way that they curate. I guess maybe it's just making sure, you know, the only thing I would say is just make sure that it does it, you know, is it going to take you away from your artist practice too much? Does it complement your practice as an artist? Are you able to, because, you know, both things are very difficult to maintain. So as long as you feel supported, I guess, in both areas, then I think it's something that works really well together. And I think like some of the nicest shows I've ever seen have been curated by artists.
Yeah, I definitely second that. Absolutely. I've got a question here from Marcus Jack, and I'm just going to read it out just completely. He says, amazing talk, Helen, thanks. I wondered if you ever feel like you have to hold your tongue when working in upper middle class environments, and if you have coping strategies for that. I found that negotiating with institutional London-based environs can feel so exclusionary.
All the time. I mean, I have a big problem with my accent, you know, like a lot of people literally don't understand me. So I've had museum directors tell me they don't know what I'm saying. So when you're trying to feel confident, whether it's job interviews, whether it's working within institutions and people don't understand your accent, it's really tricky. And also, yeah, the privilege is, you know, because a lot of my role is now having to make sure that the organizations I work within are financially stable and viable. And that involves a lot of fundraising and a lot of working with, you know, patrons and supporters. And I do find that people who are from moneyed backgrounds often find that easier. I mean, yeah, it's really difficult one to navigate. What was there a specific part of the question, or was it more just like, do I feel like I've got to hold my tongue sometimes?
More about, I guess it was about coping strategies. For
Coping. I think with every single element of my work, it's like you just need your own network of close pals who work in or around the industry, so that you have a kind of support network yourself, so you know that you're not alone. I think that's really important. So I know that there are a group of people I can speak to about things, and we have kind of shared experiences, and that we can talk about things together and kind of buoy each other up, and that really helps. I do worry about that in the future, though, because I think it's going to be harder and harder for people from working class backgrounds to get into being artists and being curators, working in the arts more widely. So yeah, I think, you know, that networks are really important, but I think, yeah, it's sometimes hard to find people. And I think, you know, when I spoke about this idea of like a divided self, that's very much kind of what I was also talking about, because there were times when I felt really at sea in the London art world.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I mean, there's so many things that, you know, you've kind of touched on that are really interesting. I was just going to ask about, I mean, you've talked a lot about kind of being away from Shetland and a possible kind of pull back to Shetland. And I was just interested in if you could talk a little bit how that might work, or have you had any kind of thoughts about what that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I throughout the years have had like so many kind of draft plans for setting things up in Shetland, because in some ways I feel like it would solve my issue of kind of feeling eternally homesick. So there was this big plan I had to set up a residency program in Shetland, and then I remember waking up one morning and going, oh God, like if I do that, then when I go home, my work will be there. And all these people that I know through work will be in Shetland. And actually, I don't want that to happen. So I think I've always kind of resisted it, because there's something about that space that is so precious to me and how I work, you know, being in a landscape, being in nature, having some time away that I actually need from home. So when I think about how I might work there, it's almost like a kind of, you know, it's like an oxymoron. So I don't know, but then I did this thing, I haven't done it for a long time, but I did this thing that was almost like the precursor to me starting to write about Shetland, which was these events. Over about 3 or 4 years, I did these events in London called Shetland Night in London, where I got chefs and musicians, so chefs from really great restaurants in London, musicians from Shetland, And we had this kind of big nights that were like, I was trying to emulate how it felt to be in like a local village hall, or maybe like at a wedding or something. So you'd have this big dinner together, and they push all the tables to one side and everyone dances, like kind of Cayley Shetland dances. And they were amazing, and really, I think really also informed the way that I think about programming things like Art Night. So the importance of the institution being a host. So when you're kind of putting on events for people, that you're making them feel welcome, and how to kind of do that in a way that isn't patronizing if you're in somebody else's community. So that the Shetland Nights in London were really important. So maybe it's just me. I think it's maybe knowing that I can do elements of my job, which is now a national festival. I can be in Shetland and I can work, feels incredible. And then I think maybe I'm hoping at some point I kind of figure out a way to do something that feels a bit more rooted within Shetland. But I just haven't quite figured out what it would be yet.
Very exciting. I think it's really interesting you talking about your divided self and that kind of space between a home and a kind of work life. I think we've probably got time for like one tiny last question. So I was just thinking really around maybe around you mentioned also your the care home experience, and I wondered if that maybe was something that you kind of took into your curatorial practice in any particular way, or any way that you wanted to expand on that in any way.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I often think back to working in that care home, and I wrote about it in the Dialecty publication. Yeah, I think it was just like a really important, you know, I did that job when I was at university, and I feel like in parallel to my studies, it felt like a really important kind of lesson in how to live and how to be with people. So I just took that with me. There's no doubt I kind of took that with me wherever else I went. And I think it's also important to remember the vulnerability of people. So regardless of how well we're doing now, there's always the possibility of not doing so well in the near future. And I think, so for me, that's always made me really consider you know, people's experiences, whether that's in a gallery, is there somewhere comfortable to sit? How do, and again, maybe this is down to class and kind of not growing up going to galleries. I still feel anxious sometimes going into galleries and museums if I don't know how to get in. And I think you know, just really considering, right, well, how is it going to feel for somebody approaching this space or this building? How are they going to, like at Cubit, there was a whole complicated buzzer system. So I always made sure that whoever answered the door was really friendly, really welcoming, and, you know, tried to support people to kind of have as much or as little engagement with the work as they felt like they needed, you know, so they could chat about it with us if they wanted to, or they could just be left alone to contemplate. But so I think it's just, you know, and it's hard to say whether that's just something I would have thought about anyway, but I think I always just come back to, I get, you know, this word care is used so much at the moment, and it's bandied about, and artists use it and curators use it. And I feel like, it's often misused, because I think that the thing about care is really just thinking about the impact that you're having on the people that you're working with, which is why I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. Is just, you know, it's your duty of care, not only to the artists you're working with, but also to the people you work with. And that might be people you manage, or it might be people who manage you. It might be your boards, it could be your stakeholders. But I think just that kind of ability to empathize with other people is so important to the way that I work. And I think, you know, there's no doubt that working in the care home was kind of solidified that feeling.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. It's been, a fantastic talk, and really thank you for sharing all of your experiences so openly and brilliantly. It's been really lovely to hear from you, and I'm sure everyone's got a lot from it. I've really enjoyed it myself as well. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's funny not being able to see you all, but yeah,
Yeah, it's very strange, kind of still hybrid situation. But thank you. So yeah, Panic Together continues tomorrow with our next sessions. I hope you'll be able to join us in person or online. And thank you so much, Helen, for a fantastic.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and have nice weekends.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.